All right? So some of these commodities under source of wealth include rum, tobacco, cocaine, slaves. The Golden Triangle is basically an area in Asia that produced very high-grade heroin. The Emerald Triangle, of course, in California, which produces, among other things, high-grade marijuana, as well. It used to be wine country, but yeah. All right? So it becomes a source of wealth. Then a political tool. So, for example, as a political tool affecting elections or foreign policy, so George Washington's first election, he lost. He lost because, first of all, the only people who could vote were rich white men anyway, and the other candidates basically stood at the polling places and handed out rum and whiskey. So they won. He lost for his first election. So a second election, he did what they did, and he won, and the rest is, as you say, history. All right, so medicine, sacrament, artistic inspiration, leisure, source of wealth, opiate of the masses, political tool, and weapon. So, for example, the use of drug substances as a weapon, that is, a tool to induce political power or literally subjugate populations. So it has an ancient history. So Chinese versus Chinese, basically, Sun Tzu says in The Art of War, the best way to win a war is to induce in your opponent the inability to fight. So Chinese generals would flood a city with rice wine. The defenders would get drunk. Then you invade when they're sleeping it off. Whites versus Indians, the whole Indian alcohol policy, where it was illegal for natives to drink alcohol before 1952, but the government, under the influence of the War Department, basically flooded reservations with alcohol, particularly potent forms of alcohol, and then basically imprisoned or killed anybody that was a leader that basically forbade the use of alcohol. So boom, that's a weapon. British versus Chinese, when we're talking about the Boston Tea Party, what happens every 4 o'clock in the British Empire? Tea time. Where do the British get their tea? India. Okay, so there's another drug in India, opium, right? That's illegal in China. Now, in terms of China, so what happens is, because the Chinese, wow, those Chinese, they only want cash for their tea. Gold, silver, but gold. They won't take it in trade.
They didn't want British manufactured goods.
There's that too, right? So the British pay smugglers to bring opium into China. A Chinese official dumped 14 tons of British opium into the South China Sea. Britain went to war with China. China lost. Terms of surrender, the British opium trade was protected in China. So the association of Chinese with opium dens, okay, is unfortunate, but their addiction was enforced by military force. Right? So yes, people can put their own pipe in their own mouth, but it has to be made available and reinforced, right? So, weapon. So this idea within axiochemistry that you can have different uses for substances, and basically when we talked about Trojan horse warfare. So drug laws in the United States are disguised as public safety and healing, all right, which do not disrupt addiction and the profit made from promoting addiction. Okay, so part of the problem was, especially in this time, and we're talking about late 19th century, early 20th century, we did not have a concept of addiction. But that's only part of it. So, like in this time, basically, heroin is in over-the-counter cough syrup. Cocaine is in Coca-Cola. They're actually promoting cocaine as a hay fever remedy. Like, wow. So there was or is, because he's still alive, conservative Republican 12-stepper Peter Bell, who had this construct where basically it's the cross part. So basically a culture decides which substances are okay or not okay, and then if they are okay, who can use them when and in what context, and if they're not okay, what sanctions or exceptions to the sanctions will exist. All right, so that's his part of it. My part of it is, okay, you got to analyze that in the context of who's using what and where, what culture did it come from? So for example, Native Americans, when they had alcohol technology, had beer and wine strength alcohol, they understood that alcohol hurt the fetus, so pregnant women couldn't drink alcohol, kids couldn't drink alcohol, adults could only drink alcohol in a religious ceremony and not to intoxication. So there's no getting drunk. A mild buzz within the ceremony. The use of tobacco. Tobacco, first of all, wasn't the name of the herb. Tobacco was the name of a pipe. But that is basically, it's sacred. You only use it for prayer and you don't inhale. So it's a visible prayer. Okay, you light the pipe. The bowl itself symbolizes female. The stem, male. The union of male and female creates the fire. The fire meets the herb. The invisible, all the four elements meet together in this place. New life. When you pray, you don't inhale it into your lungs, you blow it out. Okay? Therefore, no addiction. Indians didn't make Marlboros. All right? So among natives, then the use of tobacco and alcohol basically in the medicine to sacrament category, and it doesn't develop an addictive pattern. Right? Because of social contracts that they have within their cultural context as a part of having a gift economy. Now, obviously, since tobacco is the leading, so basically legal drugs today kill more people every day than died at 9/11. Tobacco and alcohol and pharmaceuticals being the leading causes of death. And that is drugs used the way the manufacturer intended them to. Right? So that works out to be like, using the year 2000 stat, 750,000 people a year. Legal drugs. And then at the same time period, like if you break it down every day, then basically 40 people a day die from illegal drugs versus 3,000. Why do we have a war on drugs exactly? You'll see. It's fundable.
Doctors and drug pushers.
Not just them. All right? So, culture decides which substances are okay or not okay to use based on its values, its axiology. The substance use is okay, then a culture decides who can use it, under what circumstances. If it's not okay, then you decide what sanctions will apply and who they will apply to, as well as exceptions. So often, information about drug substances was intentionally limited by practitioners to practitioners. You had to train to use this. So for example, among the Lakota, using the little smoke, which you know by its Spanish name marijuana, only the medicine person could smoke, and only to seek vision for others. So we're recognizing this as a powerful plant ally, but not everybody's smoking it. Just the medicine person. And only to seek vision for others. Similar with peyote meetings. We're not just deciding we're going to eat something that makes you throw up. We are getting together to pray for someone that may or may not be in the circle. And that's why we're sitting up from dusk to dawn with a water break at midnight. singing songs and eating this cactus that, makes you gag just to taste it, or the psychedelic effect. So it's not about getting high, it's about praying for others. Okay? So, often information about drug substances was intentionally limited by practitioners involved with drug technology or various sorts of nobility, as an example, talking about an Egyptian context. So, in the Egyptian context, alcohol technology, that is distilled spirits. In order to have distilled spirits, in order to have alcohol technology, you have to have an agricultural surplus. That is more grains or fruit than you can eat. So alcohol technology becomes a means of preserving it. In Egypt, basically, distilled spirits came about because you have to have, you have to have a still. That means you have to have metal. Okay? So you understand that distilled spirits can't be done if you don't have metal? Right? So Native Americans basically had alcohol, beer and wine strength alcohol, because that's all you need. Basically, you just need a climate that allows fruits and vegetables and other things to ferment at room temperature. Even though they had metal technology, they didn't have stills. The Egyptians had stills, but it was a state secret. Because they recognized, we can make money from this, but our values are, this is going to be bad for the people's spirits if we let this secret out. So they kept it as a secret until they were conquered by the Greeks and Romans, and then the secret got out into Western civilization without replicating the cultural values that the Egyptians had. Just like tobacco technology got out into Western civilization without replicating the Native Americans' cultural values. So here's what happens then with distilled spirits. The Puritans are giving rum to 4-year-olds to put them to sleep in the 1600s. Now, we didn't have a concept of addiction. So, right, okay, those of you who are parents, what happens if you're giving rum to a 4-year-old today? Okay, so the founding fathers did that. That was their culture. That's why Washington is handing out rum. Okay, there's no alcohol laws because they don't have a concept of addiction at the time. They connected that, you're drinking too much, you have low moral character, but they didn't see that low moral character is being eroded by overuse of this drug. You're not seeking to limit. So, cross-culturally around the world then, drug substances used as a medicine to being used as a weapon, and there could be combinations depending on the culture involved. So, relationships are most highly valued in traditional African-based cultures. Relationship includes kinship with human beings as well as their ancestors and the supernatural, that is the invisible world and the natural world. So the purpose of a drug substance within African culture is to maintain, enhance, or restore a balanced relationship. So when the use of that substance exceeded that balance, as in a state of intoxication or continued excessive use, it was not the substance that was at fault, but the person in the relationship to the substance that was out of balance. All right, so we're not blaming the drug. It's like, okay, you're allowing this to mess up your spirit. What you need to do is put that down and get it back into a relationship with your spirit. Okay, so the spirit of the person was considered stronger than the substance. And then we have specific technologies to build up your spirit and to value that spirit. All right, so prevention of addiction is accomplished by education, strengthening the individual by improving their relationship with themselves and with others. Okay? So in other words, when you keep yourself strong, you keep us strong. Right? So there's no individual right to get loaded. We don't buy that in African culture. You keep yourself strong to keep us strong. Okay, so we understand when people get drunk, why they're getting drunk. Maybe there's something happened to them, but you need to still keep yourself strong. All right, so in terms of medicine, herbal drugs contained in wild plants are first medicines. Alcohol drinks were drunk for health as well as recreation because often water supplies were contaminated. Alcohol killed bacteria. So I actually told you this about alcohol at all already. Okay, so medicine is usually only used to restore balance when one is ill. Continued use could make you ill. So that would also be part of your cultural value if you especially train practitioners to recognize that and disseminate that information. So let's see, you've seen this. So weapon, control of or elimination of a population. Chinese versus Chinese with the rice wine example, Persians versus Greeks. Basically, the Greeks were passing through an area where bees were making honey from poisonous plants. They ate the poisonous plants and were rendered unconscious. America versus First Nations, distilled alcohol. Britain versus China. Okay, and today, American state control or influence over the illegal drug trade. Okay, for example, allowing the Italian mafia to flood black communities with heroin starting in the 50s. Basically, no law enforcement action, even though it had they knew, for example, NYPD, FBI, basically law enforcement was completely aware that this was happening and made no move to stop it. In fact, what they did essentially act to do is basically arrest the black users, not the mafia drug dealers. Okay, and use of the drug trade as a weapon to pacify unruly populations. Okay, there's a reason why gangs were associated with crack, and there's a reason why gangs were supplied with crack as well as weapons, and why the gangs don't have a political orientation. None of that is an accident. Okay, so against that, historically the Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, us, the Uhuru movement, all fought against white-owned illegal drug trade for political and health reasons. The Black Panther Party had prohibition. No party member could shoot dope or be drunk or stoned while on party business. Obviously, some people broke that, but that was basically the rule. So an addicted population is a controlled population. You're strung out, you can't be political because you're just looking for your next thing. Right? So if you have corporate controlled media, are you going to basically be talking about or promoting people who are talking about gin and juice, or people like Stickman from Dead Prez who said, I haven't smoked weed or drank liquor for the last 4 years? Who do you think is going to get promoted? Is that an accident? All right. So, first drug laws. Despite the fact there was already widespread opiate use among white population at this time. So you have two different studies in 1885, the Iowa study and the 1887 pharmacist study. There were 250,000 middle and upper class addicts. So remember what's happening at the time. You got heroin in cough syrup. Okay? So these folks are they're the yuppies of their time, and they were referred to as the opium eaters. Now, literally, if you eat opium, you have, it's a slower, like, eating marijuana, it's a slower come on, longer lasting because of how you ingested it. Right? So they're opium eaters. So it's 250,000 worth looking at as a problem. Considering it as a problem, numerically. Yes? Well, who they pass the law against? Chinese. Okay? By their own count, 10,000 Chinese opium smokers. But they passed a law against them, not the opium eaters. With no rules against whites using opium. So 1900, first anti-drug campaign. So we've had like 6 drug wars in this country. 6 war on drugs. So first one, 1900, targeted first at rural white males, which at the time was the largest group of users and addicts. Immigrant groups such as Chinese opium smokers and eventually Southern blacks were targeted by this campaign.
We start with Reagan.
No. This is like 1900.
No, the war on drugs.
No. Well, see, this is one of the things, good question. Okay, first of all, but understand how that works in the context that you're asking the question in. When we hear the phrase war on drugs, we think of Reagan. Reagan was the 5th historical war on drugs. So the fact that we don't know that basically is America promotes amnesia, historical amnesia. But here's the context that was happening in. Who's the war on drugs on? And who did Reagan say was the problem? If you remember that. Not Colombians, but not bad. When they announced, yeah, who's the war against? Who's considered to be the drug user? Blacks? Right. Okay. So without saying that, so as an example, when we call, dog whistle politics, you've heard that phrase? Okay, when you blow a dog whistle, only dogs can hear it, right? So not the new racism, but there's this phenomenon has been going on. Basically, instead of talking about blacks or race directly, you use code words. Crime, criminal, war on drugs, poverty, welfare queens, people on welfare, okay? It doesn't matter what the facts are or what the data shows, all right? So when Reagan announced the war on drugs, this is jumping around, but just so you put this in context, because what he's talking about is an American tradition. So when I tell you we've had 6 wars on drugs, Reagan announced the 5th, then the time that they said just say no, when Ron and Nancy said that, the data, that is the Federal Household Survey. What the Federal Household Survey is, I call you up, say, hey, what's your drug use like? What drugs are used in your home? And this is before, obviously, and people answer. They do, right? So, household survey, that's what I'm coding, basically said 80% of illegal drug users, have I told you this before? 80% of the illegal drug users in the United States, when Ron and Nancy are saying, just say no, the Federal Household Survey is saying 80% of the illegal drug users are white men who make in excess of $50,000. Why? Because drugs are really expensive.
That includes Nancy Reagan.
Yeah.
She was starting out on Bush Wars.
Yeah. Barbara Bush was basically, she was drunk during W's pregnancy. I'm not making that up. I don't have to make shit up. So 80% of illegal drug users are white men who make in excess of $50,000 or more. So that's 80%. in the 80s. So, continue breaking it down. 13% are white women. This is also illegal drug users. If you're doing the math, you follow me on the math here, that leaves, okay, if 93% of the illegal drug users, when Ron and Nancy are saying just say no, the government's data is saying that 93% of the illegal drug users are white people, 7% of minorities, of which black people, according to this survey, are 3% of the illegal drug users. Everybody else makes up that 4. Huh. So who's going to jail? Black people. Who's selling the white people their drugs? Most of them are white people, right? Most of them. It depends on what level you're talking about. So when you look at, and this is one of the things that when I first came here that was, I don't know, I just like speaking the truth. I said, look, I came out of the LA music industry. Obviously I've inhaled. Obviously I know what a major cocaine scene looks like. When I came to Eugene, which is smaller than my neighborhood in LA, there was a major cocaine scene here in '83. Why? The money. People with disposable income. I mean, Robin Williams had, pretty bad drug habit, and one of his jokes, because in the tradition of Richard Pryor of comics capping on their own lives, cocaine is God's way of telling you you're making too much money. Ha ha ha. Okay, so there's major cocaine scene in Eugene because there's lots of people with disposable income that will spend it on drugs. In fact, when we go back to this time, 1900, we see that demographic pattern. It's rich white folks who basically are doing most of the consumption of the illegal drugs. That poor people can do drugs at all is because they're using the surplus that rich white folks aren't using, and that brings the price down in terms of economics, supply and demand. Drugs are really expensive, and you poll, the only way that you can devote any money to it is if you're focusing all your energy on feeding a habit. And there's enough surplus. I was having a discussion with one of my student workers, and I'm saying, he's saying, poor people, people in other countries think that we're really rich as Americans. I go, yeah, you are. We are. You don't understand that. 5% of the world's population consumes half the world's resources to fund our lifestyle. Okay? Our lifestyle is such that even homeless people can live off of other people's trash. Okay? Which means that there is trash, and that the trash by itself is valuable enough to survive. So you flying sign out there, or canning, or whatever that you can make. Flying sign, you can make like $200 from people, taking pity on you and all the car traffic and giving you $1 or whatever. People can make like $200 a day doing that.
There was a couple in Ashland that had a home that was valued over $300,000, and they were panhandling in Medford before it hit the papers. But that's what they did,
Yeah.
their everyday job.
Yeah. Now, in other countries, you don't have that. Okay? You don't have that. So, I mean, to make our computers, to make, calculators, talk with people, come from countries where, a calculator is like 3 months' salary, so they do calculus in their heads. Like, try that, Americans. Try doing advanced calculus in your head. English is their 5th language. So I'm saying, yeah, we spoil, okay? And we're one of the major destination countries for the illegal drug trade because everybody is basically supplying us. And going back, right? The problem is not with the poor folks. Okay, so if Ron and Nancy really wanted to deal with the drug problem, start arresting Wall Street stockbrokers. But they ain't gonna do that. I actually had a conversation with our Congressman Pt2. I'm suggesting, maybe we should drug test Congress. And he said, well, I don't think, most Congress people will have cocaine problems. I think it's more alcohol. Yeah, Peter. I was in a meeting where, the drug cops said, yeah, we had a proposal to drug test all federal employees, including Congress and us, because we just thought reasonably that would be a good thing to do and then get them into treatment, et cetera, et cetera. Congress cut their budget back $15 million for suggesting that. Oh, do we have a drug problem? Okay, so I'm just saying. All right? So, federal drug law passed in 1902 prohibited supplying opium for non-medical purposes to any Aboriginal native on islands not in the possession of any civilized power. Like, wait, why are you making a rule like that? What's the problem? Okay, so right away you see basically the agenda of the laws is not focusing on where the problem is. So here's an example. This is an ad. This was part of when I trained for the state of Oregon. So here you have white guy, upper middle class white guy in a library, books. You see the kerosene oil lamp on the table. Coca-Cola, delicious, refreshing, at soda fountains, 5 cents. The caption, prescription RX for students, notice it's underlined, for students and all brain workers. So you see why I basically talked about in an economy whose work is valued. White collar worker, brain worker. Take 1 glass Coca-Cola at 8 to keep the brain clear and mind active until 11. 1905. Okay, so this ain't an exaggeration because cocaine taken into the body in this way, like other drugs basically taken orally, has a longer and slower absorption rate. So basically they're saying, well, a glass of Coca-Cola keeps you wired for 3 hours? Wow. So yes, I have inhaled too. Understand that a line of Coke, 2 lines of Coke doing a rail basically keeps you wired for 45 minutes. So they're saying a glass keeping you wired for 3 hours. Now, when you see the formula for Coca-Cola in this time, then this becomes clear why that is. So, let me ask you parenthetically. If you required a 6-pack or 2 6-packs a day of Coca-Cola in 1905, is that a drug problem? Okay. So, when I was Churchill's drug counselor, this woman told me about her grandmother who required 2 6-packs a day of Coca-Cola when it had cocaine in it.
Well, the sugar killed her most.
Oh, well, yeah, the sugar, but yeah.
Drinking it for the sugar, right?
She wasn't drinking for the sugar. But there's a reason why there's lots of sugar in Coca-Cola, because cocaine by itself is really nasty. Probably about 8 on the peyote scale, with peyote at 10. Really bitter. So that's why you need all the stuff to cover that flavor up. So here's another one. This is fun. So I'll interpret this for you. you have a white woman, big floral hat and feather and stuff like that, and she's like gaily, and I'm not talking about sexual orientation because gay means happily in this context, she's shooting up. That's what she's doing. That's what she's doing. So inset, you can't necessarily see this, but the caption, this is a Hearst magazine, so America magazine section of the San Francisco Examiner, Sunday, February 22nd, 1908. Has it come to this? And what it's talking about is that solid gold or solid silver jewel-encrusted morphine hypodermic needles are being sold in fashionable jewelry stores in New York and San Francisco for morphine, and by extension, heroin. And you can see the demographic that they're aiming for. Would this be a drug problem, you think? Okay, so the article talks about, that you can go to these fashionable, like Saks, Fifth Avenue or whatever, and ask for these hypodermic needles, and they're hidden, but they will bring them out for you. Now, understand at this time, 1908, not that you want to go into an extensive drug history, the hypodermic needle is like 35 years old. Sigmund Freud, cocaine addict, oh, I said that right, yeah. Sigmund Freud, cocaine addict, pioneered one of the uses of injecting cocaine, and he thought it was a wonder drug. 7% solution, Sherlock Holmes. Quick, Watson, the needle. Okay, cocaine. So this is a drug problem too, yes?
Yes.
No law against it. And you can, again, see the demographic between the two ads. So, the jungle, not the hood in LA, but the book by Upton Sinclair, which detailed unsanitary practices in the meatpacking industry, led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Basically, what this was addressing was hidden opium. That is, it didn't take the opium out of the medicines, you had to declare that it was in there. Okay, so you had essentially label any drug preparation that contained opium or cocaine. All right, so even though they still don't necessarily have a concept of addiction here, they're recognizing, well, right, we had 250,000 people that are opium eaters 30 years before this. Maybe we should address the issue. So the reason I went through this, basically look at what's happening at the time, all right? So 1911, there was a person basically purporting to have a cancer cure, right? So first we're passing drug laws against people of color, rather than white people who are the larger population of drug users. Then we're saying, okay, your drugs have to, if you've got addictive drugs in them, even though we don't have a concept of addiction, you have to declare that they're there. Next, cancer cure in 1911. So we have a cure for cancer? Okay, we have a cure for cancer in 1911? Okay, so the Shirley Amendment, which basically said no false claims. About your drugs. Now, I love this part. Fears of cocaine-crazed Southern blacks in 1914 led to the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act. Like, wham, right out of the blue. Now we're explicitly dealing with race. Okay? So, beginning in 1887 and set as official policy in 1909 with the appointment of Dr. Hamilton Wright, a DC physician, who issued a report in 1910 that exaggerated addiction figures and played on the racial fears of whites. A pattern would be set for legislation connecting perceived drug use of minorities with and the potential harm for whites. So, Dr. Wright said in his report that cocaine gave blacks superhuman strength, made them bulletproof, and caused them to rape white women. It's also interesting to note, of course, there were no incidents or scientific objective data, even though he's a doctor, to back these assertions, but this became drug policy, and in that furor, right, fear of cocaine-fueled blacks led to the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act, which essentially made cocaine and opium illegal. The result was taking cocaine out of Coca-Cola, replacing it with caffeine, though Coca-Cola is still made with cocaine. They just take the cocaine part out and leave in the flavor. All right, so, wow, race. Cocaine makes black people bulletproof and causes them to rape white women. Okay. Yeah, that'll happen a lot with the Ku Klux Klan in the South, sure. Because remember, we're still segregated here. We're still being lynched. Huh. Jim Crow is firmly in place. So we talked about original position before.
Yes.
You recall that? All right. So the question is not whether race enters into the equation in terms of drug laws, but where and how far and how often. Fairly often and early on. All right? So, substance abuse problems are faced by every culture with a drug technology. So this is from Larry Wallach, who I think is in PSU now, but he was, when he made this statement, part of Berkeley School of Public Health. If a culture values all its people equally, then its response to substance abuse problems are medical health care focused. If a culture does not value all its people equally, then social control measures are used against those with drug problems who have less power. All right? So it's not a medical problem. You know, depending on which side of the river in Portland your cocaine problem happens on, treatment or jail. All right, so temperance movement, save the morals of America. So the 18th Amendment, prohibition. Now, it's interesting to note for me when I look, especially in terms of developing axiochemistry, how do different cultures approach drug problems? So the Chinese went through alcohol prohibition 10 times in 3,000 years. That indicates, at least to me, prohibition doesn't work as a strategy. It just creates an underground economy. Which, if that's what you want to do, okay, just say that that's what you want to do. But, all right? So, prohibition. That is making alcohol illegal. Creates an underground economy. So, prohibition on cocaine and other drugs, basically starting in 1914, people turned to alcohol. So with the end of the war, that is World War I, increase in racial terrorism, increase in economic opportunity in terms of racial terrorism, economic opportunity, for example, black people. Many factors caused some whites and some blacks to join the underground economy in illegal alcohol production. Stills, rum running, etc. Right? So this, of course, causes an increase in alcoholism in the black community. The temperance movement, that is, we're going to be teetotalers. That is, we're not going to drink at all. Right? Temperance movement could be considered the oldest alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs prevention movement in the U.S. During slavery, temperance movement allied with the abolitionists to basically, black people, because overseers who are beating us are drunk, we don't want to be like that. Though Massa is supplying us with cocaine, because case you didn't know, a slave who's on cocaine eats less and works more. Okay, so we're not getting alcohol, but we are getting cocaine in some southern states. Okay, replicating the practice of slaves, the Spanish with Indians and other blacks as well. But we're not drinking, as a rule, to the degree that we have data about this time. So in 1900s, the Prohibition temperance movement allied themselves with, among others, the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan's anti-drug agenda is, remember, following Harrison narcotics, drink makes you black people go crazy and want to rape white women just like cocaine. It makes you bulletproof, too. Now, at this point, I can continue on with our drug laws until the current day, which is 1970s, or we can jump to what else is going on, since we got 9 minutes. What's your pleasure? Huh? Drugs? Stay with drugs. Okay. Because it's, so understand this analysis. Like, before I started doing this, I never saw this done, but the parallels were really clear. Like, wait, there's race in drug? Wow. Okay. So there's actually some healthcare logic. So sulfa-drug deaths. So what a sulfa-drug is. So these are, notice that these incidents are reactive, not proactive. That is, they're in reaction to events that are happening. We're not foreseeing problems and trying to prevent them. We're reacting to stuff after the fact, right? So sulfa-drug death. So what sulfa-drugs are is a form of antibiotics. Now, understand that, how many of you are older than 35? How many of you know somebody older than 35? Okay. In this time, people are dying of infections. The average lifespan in America is about 35 years old. And people are dying from infections. Okay? So, bad teeth or any number of things, right? So, sulfa drugs are a form of antibiotic that's really toxic. It could kill you, cause liver damage. So, sulfa drug death. So, Pure Food Drug and Cosmetic Act. So, safety before marketing. That is, you had to test the drug before you sold it. So remember the Shirley Amendment. Okay, you can't make false claims, and the drug has to be safe before you sell it. Does that seem like kind of common sense? Why do they have to even think about that? Right? So this is the first time in U.S. history that this happened. So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act demands that the drug be tested as safe before it enters the consumer market. So this is the first time in U.S. history that this has happened in the 20th century. So previously, one could market any drug, and it was buyer beware, essentially. The only laws passed up to this point required you to A, declare opium or cocaine, and B, not make fraudulent claims. Your drug did not have to be safe. In fact, there were some patent medicines that required you to make out your will before buying them. Now, my father got into medicine because the person that taught him to read was paralyzed, and there are all these people coming to the rural South that said, okay, we'll give Uncle Jack this medicine, and he'll be walking next week. And of course, Uncle Jack died paralyzed, right, at 80, when I was like 7. So, right. That was not illegal then, right? So Dad gets into medicine because he wants to find a cure for Uncle Jack, among other things. Plus, our family believes you can't necessarily trust the healthcare system unless you're delivering it yourself. Which, segregated South, that would be accurate. Thanks. All right, New Orleans newspaper, reefer murders. Killer weed, reefer madness in the decade before 1938. which was the result of the Marijuana Tax Act. So, Federal Bureau for Narcotics had been created in 1930. Its director, Harry Jacob Anslinger, testified before Congress that coloreds with big lips lured white women with jazz and marijuana. Major newspaper publisher associated historically with yellow journalism, that is William Randolph Hearst papers, published stories about blacks and Mexicans linking the marijuana use of Mexican migrant farm workers with crimes against whites. This is also where you got, because Anslinger is basically also associating, and when I talked about what I referred to as the two Daves joke, that is Dave Frohnmeyer and also David Hawkins. So Frohnmeyer at the time was an attorney general speaking at the Oregon Prevention Conference, and David Hawkins was a prominent drug researcher talking about, risk-focused prevention. They used the same joke within 6 months of each other at two events that I was at. When I was in high school, the only people that used drugs were jazz musicians and people south of the border. So, when they say jazz musicians, who do you think they're talking about? People south of the border. Okay, so again, I'm not certain how many black people and Mexicans are going to school with Mr. Frohnmeyer in Medford in the 50s or 60s, but I do know that in Medford, there were sundown laws that were in force. So black people couldn't be on the street after dark, let alone selling people weed in Medford. Just saying. All right, so to have that as a statement that you're making in front of people and representing that to be true, not so much. All right, so Marijuana Tax Act. So understand, back in this time, every major pharmaceutical house, which includes every major pharmaceutical house in operation today, all had pharmaceutical marijuana. Then, legal marijuana drugs. Medical marijuana had already existed at this time, mostly in the form of alcohol tinctures. All right? So, what it didn't make marijuana illegal, it simply taxed growers, sellers, importers, and had the effect of eliminating all the drugs made from cannabis, as well as hemp cloth, paper, and other products. Okay? Because coloreds with big lips, yeah. All right, so drug technology can be used to heal or used as a weapon. So racist rather than scientific language is used as a persuasive tool to push legislation. That shouldn't have been replicated. All right, yes. In the late 40s to mid 50s, news reports of prevalent urban opiate use among whites and urban blacks, particularly jazz musicians. Narcotic Drug Act of 56, cabaret laws of New York. So various states passed laws against specific populations, usually minority populations, based on perception of drug use. So cabaret cards, for example, permits to play music in New York City. In order to play, jazz musicians had to get a cabaret card, which meant if you had a drug arrest, you couldn't play. This is also when jazz musicians are being used by the State Department in the Cold War. So essentially what happened here is Frank Sinatra said, Miles Davis is in my band. Any questions? He don't need no cabaret card. And you don't mess with Frank and the boys.
Chairman.
He's the chairman. That's right.
Lenny Bruce.
Yeah, Lenny Bruce, all those folks. So Anslinger, the colored with big lips guy, kept files on prominent black jazz musicians and white musicians who associated with them, admitted supplying McCarthy with morphine so he'd not be blackmailed or supplied by communist drug dealers. All right, we'll take up this more on Monday. Thanks,
online. Learn. Unlearn?